Okay, so before we start, we are going to start with things we already know. So, vertex. Remember that each corner of a triangle or an angle is a vertex. So, each of these are vertices. That's the plural, but we'll just write vertex. Midpoint is a point that gives us two congruent segments. We remember that from our proof reasons sheet. And that means that these segments have the same length. So, for example, if this segment is 5 centimeters, then this segment is also 5 centimeters. So the length of DF equals the length of FE. An angle bisector implies two congruent angles. So we know that these two angles are the same. You could mark them with an arc and a tick, or just a single arc, as long as you mark them the same. And so we can also see them as having, maybe they're both 32 degrees. They would have the same angle measure. Okay, perpendicular means that we have right angles. And finally, bisect means to cut into two congruent parts. Maybe it's two congruent segments, maybe it's two congruent angles. Whenever we have a bisector, we cut into two congruent parts. Okay, those are all things that we're going to need to use to figure out what these special segments mean. So a median is a special segment that connects a vertex, and we're just going to pick one of them here. So we'll say like point A to the midpoint of the opposite side. So we'll call that point M here. So if we have the midpoint of the opposite side, point M, then we know that those two are the same. And then I can draw the segment from A to M because that's a vertex. Now I could have drawn one from B to the midpoint of this opposite side if I knew that, but we're not going to draw multiple ones. We'll just draw the one. I just wanted to show you you could actually draw three. Okay, the angle bisector is going to cut an angle in half. So we will get two congruent angles. And so we can do that from anywhere. I'm going to do it from A just to show you. Oops, sorry, that's terrible. Just to show you from the segment above that this is not the midpoint, where this point right here, that's not halfway. It's a little to the left. And so they're not the same segment. They can be the same segment in certain triangles, but in this case, they are not. Okay, another special segment in triangles is the perpendicular bisector. Oh, there we have that word bisector. That cuts something in half. And perpendicular means we're going to have a right angle. So it's a segment or a line or a ray that cuts a side into two congruent segments at a right angle. So not only does it go through the midpoint, but it also goes at a right angle. So I'm just going to draw it with the straight line tool to make it really nice right angle. And then I will mark it with a right angle so we know that is the perpendicular bisector. So it goes right through the midpoint and it's at a right angle. Notice it does not go through point A. So I'm going to actually write that as a little note to myself. Does not need to go through point A or through the other vertex. Okay, That's important because a perpendicular bisector and an altitude are really similar to each other, but an altitude actually does go through point A at a right angle. Well, that is not a right angle. Let me fix that. So that you have a height, and altitude is like a height. So this is the segment that connects the vertex just to anywhere on the opposite side as long as it's a right angle. Okay, and then our last segment is called the mid segment. The mid is the important part because this is actually the segment that connects the midpoints of two sides. So if I have the midpoint of this side, I know it's a midpoint because those two are the same. And then I have the midpoint of this side, which I can tell because those two are the same. Then I have a mid segment. Let's call it EF. And so EF is our mid segment here. It connects one midpoint to another midpoint. I could have drawn to the midpoint here and gotten a segment going this way, or I could have drawn from F to the midpoint of BC and gotten a segment going that way. So there's multiple ways you could have drawn a mid segment here. So let's go back up and just highlight the specifics of each of these. Let me get my highlighter. Okay, so a median connects a vertex to the midpoint of the opposite side. An angle bisector cuts an angle into two congruent angles. A perpendicular bisector, you're going to get two congruent segments and a right angle. An altitude also has a right angle, but it has to go through the vertex, through a vertex. And then finally, the mid segment connects midpoints. So those are kind of the important things. I'll zoom out so you can see all of this at the same time. I'll zoom out a little bit more. So you make sure, please, that you have all of that written down. And when you turn the page, you'll see the practice, and that is in the Go Formative.